that maybe will give you a little bit more perspective around why it's called that. In the industry, whether it's networking or software development, middleware is a term that is pretty much as it's described. It's whether it's hardware or software, it's stuff that's in the middle, and it kind of presupposes that you have a beginning and an end, and then the stuff that goes in between those two is considered the middle. So with Express, as we talk about middleware, we'll kind of hopefully get a visualization of what these different functions or callbacks that we've been working with, what role they play as middleware. So if we consider Express kind of like a pipeline, that will help, I think, to kind of visualize that. The beginning of the pipeline is where the request comes in from a client. Okay, and what we're developing as back-end developers is we're developing the server. And the very beginning of this pipeline is when the request is received by the server. Express has the ability to allow us, because it's so minimal in its function, it's a very unopinionated framework, allow us to define software that can really control what happens after it arrives. And I kind of like to think of what we've been doing with these different callbacks that we've been creating as sort of registering them or adding them to a pipeline. And this pipeline that we're adding them to, you can think of it as a one-way pipeline. Once the request starts to go through the pipeline, each of these different methods that we've added to it have a chance to work on the request. Express does a favor for us with respect to this, in that it, in addition to making the request available to each of these handlers or methods, it also makes the ultimate response object available. And that does a couple of really cool things for us. It allows us to, maybe we want to add information to the request object so that as it goes from one method to the next, we can provide some context or state that is available to methods that are further down the line. And likewise with the response object, we can do certain things with it. And as we create software and create methods that we add to the pipeline, any one of those methods that has an opportunity to process the request and to modify the response can also completely stop the pipeline by sending the response back, or otherwise ending the processing. And so every method in the chain has the option or the opportunity to stop it, so that nothing down the line will even have an opportunity to look at it. And so when you consider it that way, then middleware makes sense for what we're calling these methods. And every time you call the .method or the .use method, whether it's on a router or on the server, and you provide a callback to it, it's taking that callback and adding it to the chain in order. And then when a request comes in, there's a comparison that happens with each of these methods along the way to determine if the method should have an opportunity to process it. There are two particular properties that we've been working with of the request that help to determine whether or not any given method should be able to process it. What are those two properties? What do you think they are? Two particular properties with any given method that will determine whether or not that method should be able to work on that request. Okay, rec and res, close. Those are always involved. We can talk about the homies. Typically when I say, two, that's kind of where your mind's going to get drawn because there's two of them. But Dave's got it right. It is the URI, and you could say the rec, but there's a particular property on the rec that goes along with the URI. Okay, and Robert, the body is something that is available, but it isn't used to determine whether or not the method should run. Okay, so the URI is one of them, or the URL, it could be called that as well. And then rec.method, is you got it exactly right. So it's a combination of the URI, or otherwise known as the URL, and the method. The method being an HTTP verb if you're using Express, so that whether it's a get or a delete or a put or a post, together with the URI. And you've had a chance to register a method in the pipeline that will work on any URL and or any method, right? So when we've, in fact, I'll open, if you look at the the server.js, there's a method here, server.use and express.json, okay? It looks like I've got the wrong version open here. This is something I've been working on earlier, so I'm going to get a different one open. But anyway, you can see here that we're passing in a method that gets added to our chain, and we're not supplying a URI or a method. When I say method, an HTTP method, right? So we're not specifying that this handler can only work on gets or only work on deletes, and we're not specifying a particular URL that it needs to work on. And so this is one of those methods that gets added to the chain that will work on all of the methods. But when we come down and look at this one, server.get, we're specifying both an HTTP method and a URL. And so this method is only going to be able to process the request if the request is a get with that particular URL. But they're all strung together in a chain, and it's kind of important to kind of visualize them that way. When you add methods, when you look at creating this pipeline out of middleware, there are three types of middleware that we can add. The first is built-in middleware. Okay, built-in middleware is middleware that comes together with the Express package. The express.json method is an example of that. .json is a body parser, and it's used to parse any information in the body. And if it happens to be JSON information, then it will make the body object or the body property of the request object a JSON object. It'll parse it into a JSON object. But this is an example of built-in middleware, okay, that comes together with Express. The second kind of middleware, and I think in the training kit, it described it in a different order, but there's a reason why I'm going to talk about this one next instead of third party. I'll talk about custom middleware. Custom middleware is middleware that you create, okay, or that's not, actually, to be more specific, it's middleware that doesn't come with Express. You can create custom middleware. You can create your own methods. In fact, this is an example of that right here, where we've got a server.get call where we're passing in our own method. Okay, this method is an example of custom middleware that we created. Okay, any middleware that gets added to the pipeline that's not built into Express can be considered custom middleware. Custom middleware that we don't create, but rather that we get from somebody else or from a third party, is called third-party middleware. Okay, and we're going to have a chance to have a look at a couple of different packages of third-party middleware that are custom middleware, but they were just created by somebody else, not by us. And they also were not created by the makers of Express. So it's not built into Express, but it is custom, but it's custom from a third party. So hopefully that makes sense. All three of these types of middleware, all three of them, whether it's built-in middleware or custom middleware we create or custom middleware created by a third party, those middleware functions, all three of them, are added to the pipeline in exactly the same way. You can either use a .method, which refers to .get, .put, .post, .delete, and other HTTP methods, or you can use .use. And that will work on the application or on the router object, which we had a chance to look at last time. Those methods are what take our our JavaScript callbacks and add them to the pipeline. Okay. All right. Any questions about that before we move on? All clear. Good. All right. I'm going to see if I can find. I think this is my clean version. Nope, it's not. Give me just a minute. Apparently, I didn't clean up after myself. All right, now we have a clean. Messy, messy. Yep, that's sometimes I get that way. All right, so now we've got our clean project here, and I'm going to put my terminal to the right, like I like to do. And first thing we're going to do with our project is make sure we have all of our dependencies. So I'll just run yarn to download those. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate for you as you follow along an example of using third-party middleware. There's a couple of different packages that you'll find people that work with Express use quite often. We're going to install both of those. I'm going to demonstrate one of those for you today, or as you watch, and then have you do the other one on your own. Okay. So the first one has to do with security. So if I go into Postman, actually, let me start my server. It's listening on port 4000. There we go. And if I go into Postman and do a lookup on port 4000, if you remember last time, we took a little peek at the headers when we were talking about caching. And one of the things that you'll notice when we're working with the Express server is that there's this header, the x-powered-by header. That's the name of it, and the value of it is Express. We should consider that to be a bit of a security problem. Why would that be a security problem? Why do you guys think that would be something we would not want to have returned by our server? And Express is obviously adding that on its own. We didn't choose to add it. It's just one of those things it does automatically. Okay, right. Exactly. If somebody who's looking for something to target and they get this header back, they'll know we're using an Express server, and we don't want them to know we're using Express, because if there are bugs or problems or other security issues that have been discovered but not yet fixed with Express, or maybe we haven't deployed an updated version of it, that just gives people more of an opportunity to know exactly what they could do to try to exploit our server. So removing this doesn't really amp up our security that much. It just provides some obscurity around what we're doing to try to prevent abuse or misuse. Right. So what we want to do is remove that. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we could do that. One is that we could modify our response object and take that header out directly. But it turns out that we, in addition to removing this header, there's a number of other things that we want to be able to do in terms of headers that will provide a number of security features for us. Okay, and this is where our first third-party middleware comes into play. And it's a piece of middleware called Helmet. Helmet is just a package that we can install. So I'm simply going to use yarn to add it. You can look this up online if you want to get more information. It's interesting to kind of see their approach to stopping things like clickjacking. They do a pretty good job of explaining exactly what each of the different methods that they follow does for us, and how you can control it, because there are some things maybe that Helmet does by default that we wouldn't want it to do. So now I've added the Helmet project to my project. If I go into node modules, I can see that Helmet is here. And so now I need to make sure that it's part of my middleware pipeline. So what do I need to do next? Okay, require and use it, exactly right. So I'm going to open my server.js file. And you can see I've got a couple of requires up at the top here. I'm just going to add this one to it. Okay. And then we're going to add it to our pipeline. Now, do I want this to be added to a specific route, or do I want it to be added for all routes? And does it need to be added for a specific method or for all methods? So, right, all routes and all methods, right? Okay, so let's come down here to this section, which is where we're doing our global uses. And I'm just going to add it here. Just like that, okay? Because what the object we get back is actually a method or a function, and so we'll add it to our list like that. Okay, so now I'm going to save my server.js and start my server back up. And now if I come back over to Postman and rerun this request, you'll notice a number of different things have changed with our headers. Right, so the response that comes back from our Express server that goes back to the client no longer includes the Express header, but it does include a number of other headers that have been added and or modified in order to enhance our security. Now, I'm not going to go through exactly what all these things are. You can, again, study this up online if you're interested. Like I said, there's some clickjack control that it adds. There's cross-site scripting protection that it adds, and some other things that we can use. And then if there are other things that Helmet does not do by default that you can turn on if you want. So Jimmy asks if we installed Helmet, and the answer is yes. If you look up here, I did a yarn add Helmet right up here at the top. And that's how we install it. Okay, and once we've added it, then or installed it, then we have to come in and use it, require and use it. Okay, so now what I want to do is give you some time to kind of play around with this, and what I would like you to do is install another third-party package that's called Morgan. Morgan is named after a pretty disturbing TV character. You can look up that as well if you're interested. I've not seen any episodes of it, have no interest, it's not my style. It's about anyway, I won't even go into that. You can read up on it if you want. But the package itself is actually really cool. When you install and use Morgan, what it does is it provides you the ability to have some customized logging around what your server is receiving and sending. And you have the option to have that logging go to the console, or you can have it go to a file, or both. Today we're just going to work on the console. We're going to keep it nice and simple. What I'd like you to do is use the information that you saw in your training kit about Morgan to find information about the package if you need to. Install the package and then add it to your application in this way and use it. And I'm going to put up a poll so that you can indicate what your progress is on this. So again, we want you to install Morgan, and there's a particular, there's a number of different logging formats that you can choose from. Go ahead and choose one that you're comfortable with. If you want to look at the documentation at Morgan to get a real simple view of that, go ahead and do that. And I'll give you a few minutes to do this, and I'll put up a poll so you can indicate where you're at. So go ahead and do that. Please click no on the poll if you're not ready, so I have an idea of who we're still waiting on. And then go back and change it once you are up to speed. If you've got questions, feel free to post those as well. So Josh, you asked, why do I put the terminal on the side instead of on the bottom? It's just more comfortable for me. When I read my code, I have a very top to bottom orientation. I like to see as much of it as I can from top to bottom. In fact, when I'm coding at work, if I've got two monitors, which I almost always do, I often like to have one of them set up in portrait mode so I can see more of the file, and it's just kind of my style. Ryan, if Yarn server's not working, you need to look at your package.json file and look at the scripts. If the script looks right, then you need to make sure Yarn is installed. If you're crashing, then you might have a problem with your code. You'll want to look for probably a syntax error. You can look at the stack trace that pops up on the right-hand side, and maybe we'll have a chance to pop into that and take a look. In fact, I don't know if you can do a screen share. I'd be happy to take a peek at it. Okay, so Ryan, if for anyone else that's interested, and I see there's a couple of replies here, you can look at what I've done here. I also am getting an app crash, right? And so we'll take just a moment to kind of take a peek at how you might troubleshoot something like this. It's not directly related, to the topic of middleware, but it's important to take a peek at it. What you'll notice is this stack trace, and it gives you an error. And it's pretty helpful because a stack trace is, as you know, in JavaScript, you've got methods that call methods that call methods that call methods, and sometimes you can get several methods deep, and a lot of those methods aren't even ours. They're methods within methods that are deep within Node and within Node's libraries and with other packages that we may have added before it ever gets to our code. If you'll look here in mine, server.js file on line 4, it's telling me that's exactly where the error is. And it's telling me that, I don't even know how to pronounce that, I misspelled require. It says it's not defined, and it's just simply because I have a typo, right? So if I come over to my require statement on line 4 and put a Q in instead of an A, and then save it, then you'll notice my server restarts because of NodeMon, and that fixed it. So you typically want to take a peek at that error and see if it tells you what line it's on, and try to understand where your error might be. Okay. Ali, you're asking what's the dev parameter. Good question. And we're not going to dive too deeply into Morgan, but you can get a lot of this from the documentation. But Morgan defines a number of different formats that our logging can take. Let me just take a quick peek at most of us are ready to move on. So I think we're going to go ahead. If you need some help, please post and we'll try to revisit that. But the dev parameter is me telling the Morgan system or the Morgan module which format of logging I want to use when I have it logged. Okay. So what I have right here is I'm using it, but I specified that I want the dev format to be used, which is kind of an abbreviated format that will log automatically to the console. So we can kind of see that in play. When I come over to Postman, I'll do my post. Then you'll notice in my console over here, I get this kind of a terse log entry. It shows me the method, the path, the result code, how much time it took for Express to respond to it, and then how long it is, or how big of a response, or how big of a request we received. Okay. Let's see what else we got here. Training kit states add Morgan to solution, require it. Const logger equals require Morgan, and then add a new server.use logger short before our other use and show the console. And then the question is, why are we putting it after the other use statements in this case? It really doesn't matter. They're added to the pipeline in the order which we call them. And so order does matter. In some instances, we're going to kind of get into that a little bit later. But in this case, whether Morgan is added before or after Helmet, one thing that I will say is that any other middleware that might get called could end processing before Morgan actually gets it. And because we don't know exactly what Helmet's going to do with it, there might be an instance where Helmet sends a response back in an error situation for some reason. And if Helmet's in the chain before Morgan is, then we'll never get to see the log entry for that. So it's probably a good idea to put it ahead of the other things, that's just so that it's at the beginning of the chain. I'll put it there, restart it, and then just double check that we're still working. Okay, notice that was ran in 4 milliseconds, but if I run it again, it was in less than 1 millisecond. So there's some optimization that Express is doing behind the scenes to be able to respond much more quickly. Okay, so how is the size of the response measured? It's in the number of bytes. Okay. Yeah, it's not, Ernesto, it's not kilobytes, it's actually bytes in this case. All right. Great job. So let's move on to the next section. In the next section, we're going to, so here we've just gone through an example of using third-party middleware, which is just a custom or a special case of custom middleware, right? This is middleware that was not developed by the Express team, wasn't packaged with Express, it didn't come with it. You're not going to find Morgan or Helmet in the Express documentation, therefore it's custom. But it's custom middleware written by somebody else, so we'll call it third-party middleware. Now we want to create our own custom middleware, okay? I saw somebody post an image before, and I'm going to kind of show another one that helps kind of visualize a little bit. For me, this pipeline, okay? I just created this in draw.io. The request comes in, and when it comes in, the very first middleware method that can handle it gets the request and the response objects, okay? And we're very familiar with that. And we've seen before as well what happens if we don't do a .send or a .json. In fact, just to kind of reiterate that, if I look at this get method with the slash, if I were to comment out my send method, save my server, and then run this request, you'll notice it's just going to say loading, and we don't get a response back until it times out, right? And so that's because the chain didn't get ended. Somebody somewhere needs to end the chain by either sending a response back or sending a JSON formatted response back or calling the end method. There may be other methods for ending it, but those are the ones that we're familiar with, right? So I'm going to stop my server just so I can end that request. I'll uncomment my code. And this send method is what's causing our chain to end in this case. So ignore all the other stuff that we have here and just assume that we just have this one middleware method that's attached to get with the URL of slash, and it will execute a send or a JSON and send the response object back, okay? When we create custom middleware, we're going to add a third parameter to our method. And what this does is it allows us to have a little bit of a peek into this pipeline, okay? So what Express will send to us if we will create a parameter to receive it is not only request and response, but also next, okay? And we can actually call the parameter anything we want in our parameter list. It's traditional to call it next. It actually just makes sense to call it next, because what it is it's a pointer to the next middleware method in the chain. It's actually a method that when we call it causes Express to go and find the next middleware method in the chain that matches our method in URL. Okay, and so where that becomes handy is when we want to create our own method, but we don't want to end the chain. Maybe we want our method to do is put some do some logging or some output, or maybe we want to do some lookup or validation before we allow it to go to the next middleware manager or middleware method that manages it. And so if that's the case, if we've got a middleware method that's able to work on a request, but we don't want to respond yet, we just want to move it on to something else, we do that by calling the next method within our middleware. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to demonstrate for you how that works by creating a method that does basically what Morgan does. Now, it's kind of silly to do this because we don't need to do it because we have Morgan, but this will help to demonstrate the purpose of this, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function, and I'll call it method logger, that will receive a request, a response, and then again our third parameter, which is a method that will move us on in the chain called next. Okay, so what I want to do in my method logger is I'm just going to do a console.log. Let's just say Morgan really inspired me and I want to do my own logger here, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to log the method of our request, so whether it's a get or a delete, a post or a put, and I'll just say whatever that method is, that request was received, okay? Now, similar to what we saw before, when we have a middleware method that doesn't end the chain by calling send or JSON or end, then it'll just get stuck, right? So, but here I have a method that's not actually being used by anything, but I can add it to my chain. Let's say I want to put it right after Morgan. Just like that, right? So I could do server.use and add my method that's going to stick it in the chain. And the problem that I have currently is that because it doesn't do anything to either end the chain or move it on to the next one, it's just going to get stuck. But remember what I said, you know, if I do a get on slash, I don't want my method logger to end the chain. So what do I need to do here to make sure that it gets to go to the next item in the chain? Right. Exactly. You guys all got it. So I need to put in a call to the next, right? And again, what that's going to do is it's just going to move it on to the next thing in the chain that matches. There may be things in the chain that don't match. They'll just be skipped, right? So it'll go on to the next thing in the chain that matches. And in this case, it'll probably be express.json, which if we had access to the code for that and wanted to look at it, we would see at the end of that is another call to next. And then it would, you look at all of the things that were added to the chain by our hubs router. None of those are going to match because we're just doing slash. It'll skip all of those, and then it'll do helmet. And then it'll get down to our get method, right? So this next call is going to basically allow it to move on, right? So I'm going to save this. And then, of course, inside our get method, we're doing send, which is going to cause the chain, basically to drop out and ignore the rest of it. In this case, it won't matter because there isn't anything else. Yeah, but it still works that way, though. Okay. So I've saved it. I'm going to start my server back up and go back into Postman, do my get. If we look at our body, we got our regular response back. And now if I go back to my console, you'll see that both Morgan and the method logger were executed in the chain, okay? So Kenichi asks, is this the same thing you did with Redux middleware? I'll assume so. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt on that. I wasn't there, so I'm not sure exactly what they covered with you, but the concept could be similar. I'm not a Redux expert, so I don't know for sure. But it's a pretty typical pattern I've seen. I've actually implemented it and used it in other systems that I've built. So Dylan asks, do you ever pass arguments in next, like next to this value? And the answer is that you can, and we're going to talk about that towards the end of our lesson time today. Typically you don't want to, and we'll explain why when we get there, but you can pass something in there. The short answer is that there are certain middleware methods we can create that are not normal. And when you pass something into next, it causes us to skip all the normal ones and go to a not normal one. And we'll talk about what that is towards the end. Arthur is asking, why is our logger printing out before Morgan? I noticed that earlier as well. And I think it's because they're being executed asynchronously to one another. And the Morgan logger takes longer. So if I were to actually put a timer in the method logger to cause it to wait for a certain period of time, we would see the Morgan logger log first. I did that earlier just to kind of play around with it, but that's my understanding. In fact, if we wanted to try that, we can take a quick peek at that. We'll do a set timeout. And we'll have it wait for, let's give it a couple of seconds. Okay, and we'll comment out our original console log and then save it. And then execute. And then if we go back and look, you'll see that Morgan logged first and then ours went second. Okay, and Eric says that Morgan logger is waiting for the response while the other, our custom is just firing away. One of the things I want to do with you real quick is take a peek at the Morgan code, and we'll take a peek at how they implemented their middleware. And I think you'll see it's not any different than what we've done. And so I don't know if Express is going to treat it any differently than ours because it doesn't look any different. It looks pretty much the same. And then Dave asks if we're going to have to worry about managing asynchronous middleware, especially with respect to error handling. It is an issue that we do need to be aware of, not just to error handling, but being able to move things down the chain, we have to be able to call next. And so we're not going to dive too deeply into that today because we won't have time, but it is something worth studying and diving deeper into is middleware that is async. All the middleware that we've done in the previous class sessions have involved asynchronous, and we've used the async keyword in some cases. That's something that you do want to be aware of. Okay, so good call on that. All right. We have a little bit of time for this section still, so I want to scroll down to the Morgan module and just take a peek at how, and by the way, this is a really good process for you to go through, is to take a look at other people's code. That's one of the best ways to learn how to do things. And so if you look at the Morgan index.js, you'll see a bunch of stuff in here. A lot of it's just regular JavaScript. But if we get down to here, there's a method called Morgan that takes a format parameter and an options parameter. We didn't pass an options parameter, but we did pass a format parameter when we called it. You'll notice that the Morgan method is one of the things that's being exported, and that's this method right here. So you can kind of see exactly what it is that gets executed when we call it. But down here on line 103, you'll see a function called logger. Okay, and logger takes three parameters: require, or the request, the response, and next, just like our custom code. And then you can go through and kind of see what it is that it's doing. If you wanted to try to dig into how Morgan does what it does, it defines format strings. It puts them in an array. You can access them by key. Dev was one of them. That's one of the ones that we called. And inside this logger method, it's going to make use of that. But you'll see down at the bottom of this logger method is the next method. Okay, that gets executed. And so that's what's going to cause express to just move down the chain. And that next method, again, is passed to this function here. Okay. So something to maybe dig into a little bit deeper if you have some interest in that. But I found it kind of interesting to take a peek at how they've implemented their third-party middleware. It kind of gives me an idea of how I might implement mine. Okay. All right, so let's give you a few minutes to get caught up. I'm going to do another poll. And based on where we're at with this, we may take a break now, or I can help some folks out if you'd like. Let me add some choices to this. Okay. So give me an idea of where you're at, if you guys are ready to move on, or if you're ready for a break, actually. Okay. Looks like everyone's ready to go. So let's take a 5-minute break. I'll put a timer up and check back with you in 5 minutes. There are a couple of questions coming through. I'll get to them in just a second. Okay. All right. Ali, you said method logger made you crash. Any chance you can post the text of the crash or a screenshot? Jimmy, that looks good. Nice and clean. It's saying, Ollie, that your method logger method doesn't exist. So if you take a look at Jimmy's code that he posted, you'll see down at the bottom above where it says module.exports in his server.js file is where he defined method logger as a function. And so in order to use it in your server.use method, it needs to exist as a function. So you'll want to add that to your code before you can use it. So question, in the callback of any of the server functions, like get, put, and so forth, if at any point you send a response back to the client, does any of the code beneath it get executed? That's a great question, Dave. Maybe I'm going to actually save that until we give everyone a chance to get back, because I think the answer to that will be instructive to everybody. So it's a really good question. But I'll make sure to handle that before we move on. Sure thing, man. So Ollie, by the way, if you're looking at my screen, you can see the code for this here. And I'll actually, just to simplify it, take this timeout out. This is really all that we need here. Dave, what's the correct terminology for those functions? That's a good question. I've seen, in fact, we could take a peek in the documentation and see what they call them. They're method functions, I think. It's just app.method or router.method. I think we're just about out of time. Yeah, I'm not sure what people normally call them. I just call them method functions. All right, welcome back, everyone. Yeah, Dave, I just call them method functions. There's a couple of questions that have come in. I want to talk about the one that Dave posted. He asked the question, if the callback of any of the server functions like get, put, and so forth, if at any point you send a response back to the client, does any of the code beneath it get executed? And a little bit of a clarifying question for you is whether you mean code beneath the send that's inside that same function, or if you're talking about other methods that are part of the pipeline. And in either case, I think the answer is no. That's what stops the chain. As soon as you do a send or a .json, which does a send underneath, or a .end, even a next, will stop that method from executing. Of course, next will go on to the next method. But those other methods, send, JSON, and end, and there may be others depending on how you want to format your output, that'll essentially resolve to a send, which will stop the chain and keep it from going forward. Robert asks, would we ever see something like server.use Morgan.use method logger.use express.json? That's a great example of chaining, which you can absolutely do. It can keep your code a little bit shorter. I personally, there are some circumstances where I find that syntax to be helpful, but in other cases, I find it can be convoluted and difficult. In this case, the way that you have it there, I think it would be fine. It looks easy to read and pretty straightforward. Excuse me. All right, let's move on to our next topic. And what we're going to talk about next is how we can, the topic that I have written down is how to modify the request object. But I really want to talk a little bit more before we get into that about why you would want to. The request object is the object that contains, in fact, if we look at the documentation for request, there's something wrong with my page. Let me refresh it. There we go. Request, you can see that there's quite a bit in a request object. You get the base URL, the body, there's a collection of cookies, host name, IP, the method that was used in the request, and the parameters. There's a number of different things in here. Why do you think you would want to ever either change any of these things or add something to the request object? Think about that for a second. Give me some ideas of why do you think we would want to do that? Okay, Eric suggests security. Authentication formatting. Okay, possibly. Okay, control middleware high up the chain needs the next middleware to do something for it. That's getting pretty close to what I think some of the main motivations would be. Again, if you think of it as a pipeline, you've got a chunk of middleware that has access to the request object, and but it knows it's not going to end the chain. It's going to do some things, and then whatever it needs to do, and then call next. And the next method that is executed as part of the pipeline is going to have the same request object that this middleware function has. It can kind of control what the next method does if the next method is designed to be controlled by adding information to the request object. Maybe the next method will want, maybe all the remaining methods will want the result of some kind of a database lookup. But what you don't want is you don't want every method in your chain doing the same database lookup. So the very first one that needs to do it can check to see if that database lookup has been done. And if it hasn't, it can take the hit on the performance, reach out across the network, do the database query, and then save the resulting information on the request body so that all of the other methods down the chain can just have access to the data without having to rerun the database query. So that's kind of an idea or an example of that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate for you a little bit of a contrived example, and then we'll kind of migrate that to into a little bit of a discussion about headers as well. When I say contrived, I mean it's kind of trivial and not necessarily something you would do or find in real life applications that you're developing, but it would give you an idea of how you can modify the request object and make sure that the next thing in the chain gets access to it. Okay, so if we take a peek at our code in our server.js, we'll notice that the get handler for the root is doing this, right? It's looking for a property on the request object called name, and it's assigning the value of that to something called name insert. Okay, And if we go back and look at the documentation for the request object, you'll notice that there isn't, by default, from Express, a property called name. Okay. So what we can do to, and you'll notice here that if rec.name has a value, it's going to use it, and if it doesn't have a value, then it will use an empty string. This is a ternary operator with a question mark. Okay. So what we can do here is follow this simple pattern as well, where we can create a middleware function. Let's call it add name. And of course, as with other middleware functions that are not meant to end the chain, we need to make sure to include the next property that Express will give us a method we can call to keep it moving on. And because we have access to the rec object, we can modify it, right? So I'm going to add a property to rec. And in this case, I could do a database lookup if I wanted. We're going to try it a different way here in just a minute. But all I'm going to do right now is just put my initials in. I'm going to hard code it, okay? Now, what do I need to do here to make sure that the chain doesn't stop? Somebody give me an idea what comes next. Next. This is exactly right. I kind of gave you the answer there. Good job. All right, so I'm going to call next, and that's going to move it on down the line. Now, I don't know exactly what method's going to get called next. I can't guarantee that this method's going to get called next. But as long as nothing between add name and this get method removes that, it'll be available to this method. If it does remove it, we need to make sure our application is designed in a way that removing it is the right thing to do, right? So that when we get to this get handler for the root, if there is no name, that should be the right thing, right? So in this case, we're adding it to the rec object because we know what we're doing. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and add my add name method to the bottom of the chain right before I get to get. And so I'm pretty sure that by the time I get here, the rec object's going to have this property on it. Okay, and they've already added the code for us to extract it into this variable and then use this variable in my welcome message. Okay, so if I go back before I run this to my Postman, you'll notice that there is no name. It just says welcome to the Lambda Hubs API, right? So let me open up, start my server. Oh, let me make sure I save this first. My server is now running, and if I go to Postman and execute it, now you'll notice that it's pulling that property off of the rec object and using it in my send message to identify me. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. The rec object is just an object, so you can add properties to it. Typically, in a real life scenario, you're going to be pulling information either from a database or from other locations, or doing some kind of calculation and then taking that data and adding it to the rec object so that other things down the chain will have access to it. And very often, you'll want to make sure that any calculations that all of your methods need access to the result of are in a middleware method that's being used or added to the chain early in the process, if not right at the very beginning. So that'll always take some thought to kind of organize that. So what I want to do now, there's a question. If you use add name as middleware at the top level, it'll hard code that name to the rec for every request made to the server. That is correct, because when we did our use, we're not specifying either a method or a URL, so it's going to be for every request. The only middleware methods that will not have access to that name will be Morgan, method logger. In fact, if we wanted to kind of take a peek at that, well, just real briefly, we'll do this. I'll take the same command and add it to method logger, and then okay, so we'll just basically try to pull that name off or make it an empty string if it doesn't exist in method logger. Now this is going to be kind of a timing situation. We'll see which of these gets executed first. In fact, just to kind of give us an idea. We'll take a peek at that. So now, when add name gets executed, we'll see it over here, and then when method logger gets executed, it's going to log with the name, either an empty string or with the name. But we'll notice that method logger is in our chain before add name. And so what I would anticipate should happen here is that method logger is not going to have access to that name on the rec object because it will not have been processed yet. That part of the chain will not have been processed yet. So we'll execute this. You'll notice that the name was available to our get handler, but when we go back and look at our console, in our method logger, it says get request received from and an empty string, even though we're using the exact same code to try to pull the name off the rec object. And the reason is that method logger, as part of the chain, executed before add name did. And so add name had not yet added the name to the rec object. So when method logger tried to pull the name off of the rec object, it didn't exist yet. So this variable would be an empty string. But when get executed, add name had already executed, therefore get was able to pull the name out. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. I want to take just a minute and talk a little bit about, my keyboard is really touchy today, talk about headers. We've talked a little bit about them. Headers are basically a form of communication between the client and the server that's not meant to be, and for other chunks of processing that are between the client and the server, that are not meant to be seen directly by, by anything that gets presented to a user. But in the case of an API, they can be very handy, and there's a lot of different reasons why you would want to use them. We talked about one of them, where we can control caching. We looked at where caching was kind of automatic in the browser, but we can actually control that. When the server sends information back to the browser, we could configure our server to include a header that tells the browser, do not ever cache this information. It'll always be out of date, don't cache it. And that would have prevented, if we added that, would have prevented Google from caching it. And so there are certain circumstances where you would want to do that. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at our headers, and we're going to add a custom header. Now, it's typical or customary if you're adding a new header or something that's not well known, to name it with an X and then a dash. And I'll just call it my custom name, whatever I want. In this case, I'm going to call it SK from header. Okay. So now when I send this request, it'll include this header. What I'd like to do in my add name method is, instead of hard coding it, is I'd like to just pull it out of the headers collection on the request object. Let's see. What is our headers? Collection called. Yeah, I'm missing something here about how to pull headers. Anybody know how to get headers off of? I don't think it's XHR. We'll just look it up real quick. I know there's a way to get it. I thought it would just be called headers. That would make sense. But apparently they found a reason to call it something else. Yeah, he says rec.headers. That's what I thought it was called. I may have to skip this part because I'm not sure why I'm not finding it. Yeah, I'm gonna, hopefully you get the idea. I'm not sure why I'm not able to pull it out, but I'll have to get back to you guys on that. I thought it was called rec.headers, but apparently it's not, and I'm not finding it in my code either. Um, yeah, I'm not sure where it's at. So we're going to skip this part, but hopefully you get the idea is that we can use headers to pass information in, and assuming you can get to it. And when we take a break, I'll see if I can dig up the answer and get back to you on that. Make sure that stays accurate. Apologies for that. Okay, let's see where we're at. Okay, just a quick poll. We'll get an idea of where you guys are at. So let me know if you're ready to move on. Or if you have other questions that you would like to ask or have handled. Okay, we've got someone that is still working on something. If there's something I can help you with, let me know. We've got a little bit of time. It might be helpful to the class as well, so speak up. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next topic. And I think, given the responses that you guys have had, that this will be pretty quick and easy for you of a concept. As we've talked about a pipeline, if you wouldn't mind, answer for me this question. So the pipeline is a collection of methods that will be executed, and as long as they're calling next to the next to the next, any given one of them can stop the processing from happening. So I've mentioned it a few times as I've talked. So tell me what you know about how we can stop the pipeline from processing, how we can make it stop processing and return data back to the user. Okay, Morgan says that without including next, that is true, but it also will cause the entire interaction to hang, right? So we can't just not call next. And in fact, what we're going to do will involve not calling next, but it's also not something we want to do by itself. Okay, so return, respond to the client, use a send, okay, or a send or a .send or .json. These are all accurate, right? And end as well is another method that we could do that basically will end, it'll basically send a response back to the client, but it'll be an empty response. So if we wanted to send back nothing, we could send an empty string, or we can just call it .end, okay? So let's suppose that, again, this is going to be kind of a trivial example, but it'll demonstrate the idea, okay? I'm going to create a function that basically will disable my API. Maybe I've discovered a major security bug and I don't want anybody using it, but I also don't want them to think that my server's down, right? I want them to know at least that I'm up and running, but I don't want them using any of my APIs, right? So I'm going to create a function called lockout. And again, because it's custom middleware, I need my three methods, rec, res, and next, or my three parameters rather. And what I'm going to do here, even though I'm receiving next, I'm not actually going to use it, right? I'm just going to go ahead and set my status to an error code, and then I'm going to send a JSON object with a message that says API locked out, okay? But if we go back to our image, and you can see these different methods in place. If this method, maybe it happens to be the second, or maybe even the second to last middleware method that gets called, because it's calling send, it's going to drop out of the pipeline and stop the pipeline. So whatever comes after that won't be executed. Okay. So I've got this function, and now what I want to do is add it to my chain. Okay. So there's a lot that will happen here. We'll have our logging. We've got our body parsing, anything that's in Hub's router. Our security is going to add all the headers that we want. It'll add the name to the rec object, and then it'll hit this lockout method that will stop the chain. So we save that. That'll restart my server. And then if I come back to Postman and do my get, you'll notice I get this JSON object back that says API locked out. Okay. And earlier somebody asked, you'll also notice that I did still have my logging, right? So I've got my logging methods that are in here. And somebody earlier asked where in the training kit it said to put Morgan at the top, and I had put it at the bottom. And it is proper to put it at the top if you want your log, you want to ensure that your logging happens. Let's see what happens if I take Morgan and move it to the bottom. Okay, and I'm actually going to stop the server, clear my screen, so that we get a really clean look at this. If I come back into Postman and then send my request, I get this back. And what you'll notice is that my method logger worked. That's the thing that does this get request received from. That's my custom logging thing that I created. My adding name method was called, but my Morgan method was not called, right? And that's the one that has the more attractive, more informational logging entry, right? And that's because I put that after this lockout. Now, of course, if I comment out my lockout and then rerun the request, I get my regular response, and of course, we'll see the Morgan log happens here. Okay. Ernesto asks if there's a .close. I'm not sure. I don't. I think there might be, but I don't think it does. There's not on the request a .close. I've seen it somewhere else. Apparently not in this framework. I don't see it in the documentation. Of course, I also don't see .headers, which I thought existed. So never mind about that. But no, I'm not aware of a .close. Well, access to data and headers. To access data and headers, you do a .get. Okay. Thank you for posting that, Will. You can also use rec.header with as a method call. So if we look under methods, I don't see that as a method either, but apparently it is. So let's give that a try. Because I've got my request with that my custom header, and just as a test here, I'm just going to do now I have a headers connection or collection. This is really, really interesting to me. I'm going to have to dig into this. I don't understand why that would be. I'm assuming I need to put the name of the header. Like that. And let's see if that will do the trick. Yep, and then you can see my SK from header value got logged there. So thank you, Will, for posting that. It's good to know that. Yeah, so the rec.headers with an array selector is what I was intending to do. And as I mentioned here in my get method, it is interesting to me that I can see it, but for some reason in my other methods, I was not able to see it. Very interesting. I'm going to have to dig into that. I'm not sure why it wasn't showing up, but thank you for the information. Something I've encountered before. Okay, what I'd like to do now is, so you've had a chance to see how we can use a method to stop processing. If there's an issue, if we've got a middleware handler that knows that because of a circumstance that we need to either return or otherwise stop the chain, right? So what I'd like to do is what I'd like you to do is create a middleware method and add it to your chain. And we want the method essentially to return a 403 with an error message if the current second, so you've got hour, minute, second, the current second of the time is a multiple of 3. So use what you know about that. I think we've done a similar exercise in the past, so it's a very similar solution. We want a middleware function added to the chain that will prevent any of your route handlers from processing if the current second is evenly divisible by 3. So I'll give you a few minutes to handle that. I'll throw up a poll so you can let me know how you're doing, and if you need some help, feel free to post about that as well. So how do you access, question, how do you access this second value in the time string? So it might depend on how you're getting the time string, but I'll point you to the new date object. So create a new date object, and there's a method on the date object that will return the number of seconds, the current number of seconds, as a number. So it's not a string, but it's actually, you can get it as a number. Let me know, Robert, if that didn't answer the question well enough. Awesome. Okay, we've still got some folks working on it. So I've gone ahead and started to code mine up. I'm going to go ahead and add it to my chain. Okay, so what if it's evenly divisible by 3, what I want to do here is set my status code to 403. That's just an error code. It's a very common error code that is used when you're not authenticated or when you don't have access or when access is forbidden to the resource. And typically, for a web page, typically means that the page you're trying to access is not something that you're allowed to see. But in the context of an API, it just means we're not authenticated, or otherwise we're denied access. Okay. For some reason, we don't like things divisible by 3. Okay, so what should I do if it's not evenly divisible by 3? Okay, so I've got this middleware method that's checking to see if the number of seconds, the current number of seconds, is evenly divisible by 3, and if it is, it's going to stop processing. But what do I need to do if it's not evenly divisible by 3? Okay, right, just next. Awesome. So that's why we have the next parameter, is so that we can continue on in the chain. And in this case, this method doesn't do anything other than stop processing and return if the conditions are such that we should stop processing and return. Time. I like Izzy's syntax is good. It's using that ternary operator. Where is the SECS, that seconds variable, coming from, Izzy? Okay. Date and time above. Okay. So it's a global constant. You created it as a global constant. Okay. Good. No, it's good. I mean, it's a. So you made the comment, maybe bad to have a global var. Their globals are not bad. They've got a role to play. They can make things a little more complicated for somebody else who's reading your code. So you want to be careful how you use them. But I think it's good to know how to use them. So I think it's fine that you did. I just didn't see it in your function when you posted it, so I was curious to know where it came from. Okay, so here I've got my gatekeeper method in place. And if I go to my postman and do a request, looks like I'm fine. And then here, I'm not, right? So one of the things that we can do if we want to just kind of double check that our code's working is we can log and so that way, when we get a failure like that one, we can come back over and see what the seconds was. And you can see the seconds in this case was 39. It is evenly divisible by 3. So we know our code is fine. And in this case, it let us through. And that's because the seconds was 50, which is not evenly divisible by 3. Okay. Okay. Looks like most people are done, so we can move on. The next thing we want to take a look at when it comes to middleware is the concept of local middleware versus global middleware. Okay, or middleware methods that are restricted to a specific context or a specific, we'll say context, or those that middleware functions that are meant to execute on a broader context. So when we talk about local versus global, you can have global in a file and local in a file, and you can have global to your entire application. And in this case, what we want to do is create a middleware function, and this is, again, kind of a trivial example that's really meant just to demonstrate the concept. And so I'm going to open my, let me close my node modules folder. I'm going to open my hubs folder, and I'm going to open my hubs router file. Okay. And what I want to do in here is I'm going to create a middleware method that isn't global to the application, but does execute for everything that's in my hubs router. Now, if you remember, when we look at the server.js file, our hubs router is mounted to the /API/hubs base URL. So anything that is /API/hubs/whatever is going to be handled by middleware that's in the hubs router module. Okay, and so what I want to have here is a method, a router or a middleware method that works for all of these URLs, all the /hubs/API/hubs URLs, but not anything else, including our root, right? And so I'm just going to create a simple function that that demonstrates this. And again, it's a pretty trivial one. I could create a separate function and then use it, but in this case, I'm just going to do an arrow function. And all I want to do is just log something to the console. Okay, and then because I want it to continue on, I need to make sure I call next, right? So what this is going to demonstrate is how you can have what you might consider to be it's global within this router, but it's not global to the application. So even though I'm not specifying a URL here, when we look at this sort of model that I drew, notice that in order for a middleware method to be able to work on the request or have access to the request and process it, the request's method and URL have to match, right? So in this case, I'm not specifying a URL, but kind of I am, because I'm adding this middleware to the pipeline for this router, which is bound to a specific URL, right? And that URL that it's bound to, again, is this API hubs URL. So anything that's after API hubs, including API hubs, will be handled by this middleware, but not anything outside of it, okay? Make sure my server is still running. And I'm going to come over to Postman. And to kind of give you an idea, in fact, I'm going to stop my server and clean this up again, just so it's a little easier to see. So our method that we just created is going to say hubs router baby, and because it's in the hubs router, if I hit the root URL, we should not see it, that message show up here. Okay, and we see that is the case. On the other hand, if I do API/hubs, you'll notice that we do get it. Okay, so this is just demonstrating the idea that you can have something that's global within a file, but not necessarily global to the app. It's just, again, showing the power of using a router and organizing your code so that all of these URLs, all the /API hubs URLs and their handlers are all in one location, because now we have the ability to create something that will work on all of them in the way that we've done other global things, but just within the context of that one router. So Ernesto says, so that would be a global middleware for that route. That's exactly right. It's global within that route, that router module. Question, would that affect subroutes of API hubs? And the answer is yes, it would. Right. So this is basically creating a pipeline that of objects that are only going to be runnable on requests that have a URL that are based in API hubs. So any of the subroutes would also be processed. Okay. All right. Why don't we go ahead and take another break? It's 9 o'clock here in Utah, 8 o'clock there in California. And we'll start a 5-minute timer. Again, I'll be happy to handle questions if you want to post them. If there are questions that you ask that are, I think the answer would be beneficial for the whole group, then I'll wait until the break is over. But if you have a specific challenge that you need some help with, I'm happy to help out with that. But I'll go ahead and start the timer now and check back with you guys in about 5 minutes. Oh, Eric, you're on the East Coast. It's beast mode, man. 11 p.m. Ernesto, I actually grew up in Houston, a little town called Magnolia. It's out near the Woodlands, northwest of Houston. Here, I'll bring my server.js back up. Give me just a quick sec here. I'm not sure if you want to see the top or the bottom of it, but I'll leave it there. Just let me know. Work in Magnolia. It's an awesome, what used to be a little town. It's not little anymore. And that's quite a drive from Katy to Magnolia. You must love where you live and love your job too. When I do console.log rec header, I get undefined in console, even though I've added the custom header into Postman. Yeah, that's interesting. Jimmy, I don't know if you used a capital X in Postman to make sure that the case is the same. It shouldn't matter. I think the case is insensitive. And the undefined that you get, I'm not sure what, if you could post that, I'd like to take a peek at that. Bottom of server. There you go. There's the gatekeeper method. If you want to take a peek at that. Thank you, Marco, for posting that. Yeah, it looks fine, Jimmy. I'm not sure. Can you do a screenshot of your Postman headers? I'm sure it's probably fine, but I'm kind of grasping at straws here. I'm not sure why. Oh, good. Well, the single quote should work, Robert. That's a good call to put it in doubles, but single should work. Jimmy, I don't know. How to take a screenshot depends on what operating system you're running on. Snipping tool, I think, might be for Windows. I run on a Mac, and I have an application called Snagit that I use, but it's what I use. So Cedric, headers you said headers is a property of the rec object with the plural, and it is, and that's what I had thought. But for some reason, it wasn't showing up in my autocomplete, and I don't see it in the documentation. But then later it was showing up. It's something weird was going on there. I have to figure out what it is. But what you posted there is accurate, rec.headers. But I think what Jimmy's posting is rec.header as a method call. which is what I did in my code that worked. So you can pass the header name in a method call to retrieve the header, and that should work. Okay. All right, that ternary operator might need a semicolon. No, I think that should be fine. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, Jimmy, it looks like you're doing it right. We'll have to dig into it maybe in the next break or towards the end. I want to get through the rest of the material, but it's an interesting challenge that you have. I'm not sure why that's not working. Everything looks right. I'm sure that there's something you and I are both missing that we can get sorted out. All right, let's move on to the next topic. Again, I think this should be fairly straightforward, given that you've got a pretty good handle on how middleware works. What I'm going to do now is here in my hubs router, I want to create a middleware handler that validates an ID. So I've got a number of methods here in my hubs router. This is my server. My hubs router that take an ID parameter in the URL. So I've got a get with an ID, I've got a delete with an ID, I've got a put with an ID, and here's a post where I'm posting messages with an ID. And what I want to do is create a method that can validate that the ID is valid without having to duplicate that code everywhere. Because if I later want to change how I do that validation and I have chunks of that code everywhere, then I have to go find every place I've used it and try to change it and make it accurate. So it'll be easier if I can keep it all in one place. So that's what I want to try to do. Now, in order to do this, what I'm going to do is pass the ID to our model, our data model, to have it do a lookup in the database. Okay, so as we've done in the past when we're working with Connects, it's a promise-based API, and we're using the async await syntax with that promise-based API. And I'm going to do a call on the hubs module. And so similar to other methods that we have where we're making a call, that's a hubs. We'll take a peek up here. For example, this one, our method needs to be async because we're going to do an await to wait for the database to return. So I'm just going to make this a function. So I'm going to make it an async function, and I'm going to call it validate ID. And like our other custom middleware, we're going to take the request, the response, and the next parameters. And what I want to do here is I'm going to deconstruct the ID parameter out of the URL. Okay, so here I'm going to say off the rec object. Okay, so my intention is I'm going to plan to use this middleware on any method that has the ID parameter parameterized in the URL with the colon, like this, or templatized, I should say. And because of that, I can expect that the ID object should be in the params property of the rec object. Okay, we've used that syntax before, so it should be familiar to you. So if there is an ID in params, it's going to be assigned to a variable called ID. Actually a constant. Okay, what I want to do with that is I want to try to retrieve a hub from the hubs data helper. But there's a find by ID method there, and what we need to pass in is our ID. Okay, so as is consistent with our hubs module, in the past we know that when we do a query, if there's not a match, it returns an empty object, right? So we're going to use the hub variable to test whether something valid came back or not. And if it did, then what I want to do is save the hub object on our request object. And again, this is just demonstrating the ability to use the rec object to pass information on to other handlers in the chain. In this case, we're not actually going to use it, but just demonstrating an idea. I'll add it there, and then we want to call next so that we can continue on in the chain. But if, however, hub doesn't exist, then in this case, what I want to do is set the status of our response to 404, which means not found, and then go ahead and respond or end the chain with a JSON message. We could say ID not found. Okay, so let's take a peek at this. Run through it again. It's an async method because we're calling a promise-based API within it using the async and await syntax. And again, remember, putting async in front of the function ensures that any return value in the function or any exceptions that are thrown from within the function are wrapped in a promise, so that we can keep the promise-basedness of the thing running all the way up through. That will also help ensure that the error handler in Express can properly handle any errors that occur within this function without us having to wrap it in a promise. Okay, and so what we're doing again is not dereferencing, deconstructing the ID parameter off of the rec.params collection, and then using it to do a search in hubs to see if there's a hub with that ID. And if there is, then we're going to save it on our rec object in case anybody else needs it without having to do the same database lookup. And then we'll move on to the next thing in the chain. And if there's not one, then we're going to return a 404 error. Okay. Now that I have this function, what I want to do is I want to use it. But a question I have is this middleware function something that I want to use on every single one of these route handlers that I have? Okay, Robert says no. No. Okay, just on the methods with IDs. That's correct. And because the problem would be, what would happen if I put that into the chain and allowed it to process this URL? What would happen in that case? I'd get a 404. All right, even though it's a valid URL, it would return with a 404. And so we absolutely don't want to do that. So what we want to do is we want to use it, but remember that even within this router module, if we do the use like we did up at the top here, it's going to apply to all of these because this is going to work on everything in the base URL, including this get handler here. So instead, we're going to use a little bit of a syntax change on these .method methods. It also works with .use, but we're going to use it on the .method method. Notice that the .method functions like .get, .put, .post, and so forth, their first parameter is a URL, and their second parameter is a handler. It turns out that we can add more than one handler, right? So as I start to type, my autocomplete comes up, and you can see I can choose my validate ID method. And similar to the async method that we defined directly in here, it's the same signature, only it also has next within it, right? So, but it is a valid middleware signature that we want to use on our any of our methods that take an ID, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add those. to all of my methods that take an ID. Okay. All right, so I've got those in there, and now I want to do some testing to make sure that it's going to work. So I've saved it. Let's start my server. Everything looks good there. So in order to test this, the first thing I'm going to do is just test my API/hubs root. Okay, and that returns with all of my data, which is as I expected. And next, I'm going to try to access a single hub by ID. So I can see that the ID of 1 is valid. So if I execute that, it returns properly. And I'm going to try it with one that I know is invalid. And notice that I get back my 404 with the message ID not found. Okay, and so all of that validation is happening for each of those methods that have an ID template in the URL. And you can see how that pattern can be useful to allow you to selectively create, whether it's validations, authentication validations, or other validations that you want to do in each of those methods. Okay. One other thing that we can do as well is use this to maybe simplify or clean up some of our handlers. So if we look, for example, at this get handler for this /:ID, you'll notice that part of what we're doing here is this find by ID, right? And then we're doing this same test. We're saying if there's a hub, then return this. And if not, then return a 404. Okay. Turns out that we really don't need to do that because it's being done by our validator, right? So we can kind of clean this up by simply saying status 200, and then we can return a JSON object. And where would we get our hub object that we want to return? Where can we find that? rec.hub. Nice job, Will. Because we saved it, our validator saved it on the rec object. So here we can just return it. Does it feel uncomfortable to just assume that we can return a 200 here? If it does, then you're probably thinking correctly. But on second thought, you realize it's just fine because we've got our validation method, right? When as you get more familiar and comfortable with that pattern, then it becomes more useful. Okay, so that can allow us to simplify our code quite a bit. Okay. So Will asks, Dave asks, how about handling errors returned by hubs.findById? Good question. One thing that I didn't do is I didn't wrap my async function in a try catch, right? So I wanted to do that. It was a good call. And then I can take all of this chunkiness here and put it in my try catch. And then if there is an exception that gets called, then we can do res.status 500 and then return our error object. Okay. So that's a good catch. Thanks for pointing that out. It is something that I had missed. Okay. What we should do now is a little assignment that I'd like you to complete. What I'd like for you to do is create a middleware method that ensures that a body was sent, and then add it to the chain for any route handlers that would fail without a body. Okay, so use the similar pattern that we've done here. You're going to create a middleware function, and then you're going to use it in methods that need a body. Okay, and then if there's not a body, what we want it to do is return a 400 with an error message saying that a body is required. Okay, so I'll put up a poll so that you can respond and let me know how you're going. I'll repeat that again just to make sure you understand. We want a middleware function that validates that the request has a body, and then add it to the chain for methods that need a body. Okay. If you need more explanation than that, please let me know in the chat, and I'll make sure to clarify that. But I'll put this poll up, so please respond to the poll so we know where we're at. Thank you, Robert, for posting that. Yep, that's the assignment. So a question was asked: middleware can be deployed at a specified at the application/root route and at the method level. And the question is, can we have more middleware methods or more middlewares in sequence in the same method, each to tackle a specific task? And the answer is yes. You can do that. I've seen in some of the samples and demonstrations that I've looked at a particular syntax that makes it really hard to read. And I'll show you how I would do that before I go on and solve the solution. So thanks for the question. For those of you that are still working, feel free to stay focused, but if you want to take a peek at how we might do this, I'll give you an idea of how it would work. We could, for example, say router.get, and we'll do this on the root of API hubs, and then okay, and here we might say first handler, and then similar to how we could just separate these with commas, we can do another arrow function like that. Okay, and you can format this however you'd like. Another, maybe even more readable syntax might be something like this. To handler 1, requires next. Okay, and then we can do handler 2. Of course, I want to remember to call next in these. And then I could do router.get maybe on the root, and then I can just add these in, handler 1, handler 2, like that. In fact, a lot of the samples that I've seen as I've looked at other people's code and how they've done it, they follow this. In fact, what many people will do is take these handler functions, they actually call them controllers, and they'll store them in a controller file just as function definitions like this. You know, they might be async functions or whatever is needed. And then they'll have a routes or a router file that doesn't do anything other than this, right? So they'll require their controller that goes along with that route, but the route is just a series of lines that look like that, you know, but with different URLs and different methods, of course. But it's very clean. It's very easy to see. You know, very readable, rather than this kind of syntax that I did here, which is still somewhat readable because they're really small. By the way, you'll notice that I need to put my next calls in here as well. Okay, these are just methods that are added to the chain, and you can do them, you know, like this. There's another syntax that you can use if you want to use multiple methods, is you can add them to an array and then just pass the array in. So it would look something kind of like this, you know, whatever that array is. So there's a number of different ways that you can do it to make it clean, but the gist of the question was, can you have multiple handlers for a given route? And you can, and you can have multiple router.get calls with different methods in them, and it just adds them to the chain. That's all it does is makes the chain bigger and bigger. Request to drop this here for us to have review. I'm assuming you're talking about this that I just did here. Happy to do that. If you don't mind, I'm going to, I'll just post it here. It's not exactly perfect. You know, there's some non-coded in there, so be aware of that. But hopefully that'll help you in a reference. Is there a limit on the callback functions you can include in a router.get call? There's probably a practical limit, Dylan, but I don't know if there's a specific limit, or if there is, what it is. That was something I'd have to look up or test with. Might be worth you maybe testing that and seeing if you can find the answer to that, and then letting us know. Is it possible to import functions from another file for cleanliness, like the DB imports? And yes, that's, as I was saying earlier, what I've seen before in a lot of code, and the way that I personally prefer to do it, is to take these functions and put them in their own module, you know, called the controllers module, that has all the functions in it, and then have a routers module that just has this. It makes it really easy to get through all the different routes that you want to be able to manage in that routers module. So the hubs-router module, if you look at this one, you know, we've got a bunch of function definitions that are in line, and it does make it more difficult to read, right? It makes it more difficult to find these routes. But you know, just because I'm kind of weird, what I'll probably do is after we're done, is I'll go through and implement my own router, hubs-router like that, and then maybe post it up for you guys so you can kind of see you know, what that would look like. It's a lot cleaner, a lot easier to read and maintain. You bet. Can I see your route.use function? Which one? At the top? This one here? Okay. Let's do a quick time check. It's 9:30 right now. Okay, and I had hoped to have a few minutes to go through error handling. What I will do is maybe just mention it, and then we can wrap up. You know, you guys can take a peek and more about it online. Error handling is really similar to what we've been doing with adding routes what do you call it? Adding why am I drawing a blank? Middleware methods to the chain. You add middleware methods that are specifically meant to handle errors to the chain in the exact same way that you do any other middleware method. You just add it with the .use or or in a dot method handler. There's one difference between a middleware method that's meant to handle errors and those that are not. So you've seen us use the rec and res, or what is commonly called the homies, and you've now seen us create custom middleware that adds a third parameter called next. When you create middleware that's meant to handle errors, there's a fourth parameter that you add, but you actually add it to the beginning, right? So instead of rec, res, and next, you would have error, rec, res, and next. I'll give you an idea of what that might look like. I'm just going to cut and paste some code so it's a little easier than typing it. So this would take a function and add it to the chain with an error. And the way that you cause Express to skip everything in the pipeline until it finds an error handling method is that when you call next, you pass a parameter to it, okay? And that parameter gets passed to your handling method in the error parameter. So at some point, if I were to call next, instead of just calling it like that, I might create an error object and then pass it in there. And then what that causes Express to do, I've got another little thing here, is it causes it to skip through the pipeline until it finds a middleware function that has a signature that will accept the error method. And within that error method, you can call next to continue on with the pipeline, even to a non, if you call next and you don't pass that parameter, then it'll go on to the next normal middleware handler. But if you do pass the error, then it'll go on to the next error handler. Added to the end of your pipeline is a default error handler that is for Express, right? So as long as you're calling next and passing a parameter, it's ultimately going to end up to expresses, which will then output your call stack. But just like in any other method in your middleware pipeline, you can call the send in JSON or end methods to drop out of the pipeline, send back an error message if you want. So again, it's pretty similar to what we've done to add middleware methods to the pipeline. You just create one that has as its first parameter an error parameter. Traditionally, you would pass an error object with a capital E. That's a node object of the class type error, but it doesn't have to be that. You can pass anything you want. And typically the parameter name is error, but it doesn't have to be. You can call it whatever you want. But if you want your code to be readable and to be easily recognized and maintainable by other Express experts, then you would pass an error object, and then your parameter would be called error. Other than that, their error handling methods are no different than any other middleware method that you would add to the stack. You can add them at any time. What we won't dig into, but encourage you to research on your own, is how important it is to make sure that an error that happens in async code gets passed back to Express through the next method. You have to call next, pass that object in. That makes sure that Express will have a chance to handle it, and otherwise your request will get stuck and you won't actually respond, and you'll have a problem. So with that, let's see, what was the code solution? Let me post that. I know we're after time and I don't want to, let's see. I will post it to the chat, Robert. I apologize I didn't get to it before we're out of time, but we are 5 minutes over and I want to make sure we end as close to on time as we can. But I will post the solution to the chat so everyone has a chance to see it. It's pretty straightforward. I think you guys will be able to get through it without any issues. And with that, I will say goodnight to you guys. Thanks for your participation, and we'll catch up with you guys on Wednesday. Have a great night, guys.